wants friendly consultations with the Philippines over the South China Sea issue following the meeting between President Bongbong Marcos and Chinese President Xi Jinping.
The bilateral meetings are really just a kind of getting to know you. And that was the same with our meeting.
The two leaders discussed the strengthening of Philippine-China relations, particularly in the sectors of agriculture, energy and infrastructure, as well as people-to-people connections.
Pilipinas at China dapat daw panatilihin ang friendly consultation sa mga issue sa West Philippine Sea. Ayon yan kay Chinese President Xi Jinping matapos ang bilateral meeting nila ni Pangulong Bongbong Marcos sa APEC Summit.
We spoke a little bit about regional issues, but mostly about the plans that I have for the state visit that I will be undertaking to China in first week of January. So whatever details need to be taken up between the Philippines and China will be taken up then.
Write a new chapter in friendship. That is part of Chinese President Xi Jinping's message to President Bongbong Marcos during their bilateral meeting at the APEC Summit. He also talked about consultation and proper handling of disputes with the South China Sea row still unresolved. What kind of relationship is ahead for the Philippines and China, at least over the next 6 years? We discuss in this episode of The Chiefs. Welcome to The Chiefs. Ako po si Robbie Alampay at kasama ko po ngayon dito sa studio sa Mandaluyong Ed Lingao of One News. Bok, mukhang tayong dalawa lang.
Oo nga eh. Gusto subukan, tawagan mo yung dalawa.
Pero we have a special episode. Today, kita nyo naman, napakaluwag, napakalaki ng desk namin because we will have an all-live show today.
May buffet tayo?
May buffet. Papatawag natin ng mga galing sa Wagpo. Matikman naman natin yung ano. Mas maganda ang setup nyo dun eh.
Gusto mo, lumipat tayo dun yun.
Pero ano ba ang balita, Ed?
Well, nabuhay si Yamashita.
Ano? May nahanap?
Hindi.
May nahanap?
Ang kinonfirm ni Justice Secretary Remulla na he was informed August or September by Bantag na may Yamashita gold daw doon sa area. Mukhang nag-express ng interest si Bantag. According to Remulla,
This is Remulla.
Yeah, that's Remulla.
Now, the Bucor is under
Remulla.
Under Remulla. Does that mean that he gave tacit approval for the
sabi ni
diggings?
Remulla, this is according to him, sabi ni Remulla, he said, no, don't do it.
But
then,
okay.
then we have this.
Then other questions arise because dati sabi, swimming pool lang yan. Pero,
May isa pa. It turns out na as early as last year, maybe even earlier, there was supposed to be a joint venture agreement between the Bucor and the Agua Tierra Oro Mina Development Corporation to develop parts of Bilibid into a business center.
sige.
So,
But either way, this is not part of what has been put forth as an explanation dun sa 200 meter by 30
yun
meter.
ang sinasabi ni Bantag in one of the interviews today in one of the other networks na itong JVO with Agua Tierra Oro Mina or ATOM, kasama dyan yung hukay.
Okay, sige.
Hindi ko alam kung Aqua Park.
Sige, because para lang malinaw, hindi po ito yung episode natin, pero linawin lang natin before we move on. Kung sinabi ni Remulla that tanda niya, binanggit sa kanya yung theory na may Yamashita gold dyan, ibig sabihin, is he saying that that is in fact what that dig was about?
That's what he's saying.
And then therefore, meron ng kaso against Bantag.
Yeah, and that's the other part of what he was saying. Na malamang they will charge Bantag for illegal. I'm not sure kung anong definition, anong term na ginamit eh.
Yeah, it's not quarrying.
Hindi naman sa illegal excavation eh. But if it's a treasure hunt, there are laws covering that.
Marami na eh. I mean, you would think. If he said no, for example, if explicitly said, wag mo gawin yan, no, and then he did it, obviously meron ng isa doon.
Yeah,
If
and
there was
one-
treasure hunting,
The lone
unauthorized
treasure hunting, you need a permit from the director of the National
National
Museum.
Museum. Okay, well, we'll have to devote another fascinating episode on that. But for now, we will have a whole panel tonight. We'll be talking about Philippine-China relations. We'll be talking about foreign policy. We'll be talking about this relatively still new presidency of President Bongbong Marcos. Our guest after the break. Keep it right here on One News. Welcome back, the Chiefs. Ako po si Robbie Alampay. Kasama natin si Ed Lingao, and we'll be talking about several topics tonight. To be honest with you, we don't know how many topics we might touch on. But first, the recent meeting of President Bongbong Marcos and Chinese President Xi Jinping at the sidelines of the APEC. Joining the discussion, or starting off the discussion, political scientist Cleve Arguelles, geopolitical expert Richard Heydarian, and Robin Garcia, also a political scientist. Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to the Chiefs.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Good evening.
Good evening.
It's the first time to have a live panel.
Welcome. We haven't had a live panel in a long time. We've had live
Live Zooms.
and guests
panel
also.
Zoom,
Meron
yeah.
tayong mga live in studio, but this is the biggest panel we've had in quite a while. Okay, so let's just jump straight into it because I imagine we'll be covering a lot of things. Richard, let's start with you.
Yeah.
Sabi ni Xi Jinping, new chapter in friendship. What does that mean?
Well, I mean, first of all, the timing is important. Remember, Kamala Harris, the U.S. Vice President, is coming to the Philippines, and not only to Manila, she's going to go to Palawan, where most likely there'll be, conversations about enhanced defense cooperation agreement, its implementation. We're now not looking only at 5 bases potentially being open to Americans. Kasama dyan yung Bautista Air Base sa Palawan, na malapit sa Kalayaan, Group of Islands, at saka yung and of course towards the north. But we're looking at potentially even up to 10 bases being open, including some in Batanes area to the north, or Cagayan, which is close to Taiwan, because biglang naging super mahalagang Pilipinas sa Amerika dahil we're not only at the front line of the South China Sea disputes, we could be potentially at the front line of a Taiwan crisis in the coming years, or months. So in light of that, I think China wants to get a feel, like, how is it going to be with Marcos Jr.? And as I semi-forecasted 4 or 5 months ago, I said Marcos Jr. will be more like his father than Tatay Digong, right? On foreign policy, right? He's not going to be, bash US, nice to China. He's going to be more like, I'll be okay with US, but I want to be also okay with China. Now, whether he can pull off this balancing for the foreseeable future, let's see. And I want to also watch what China's reaction going to be to Kamala Harris' visit to Palawan and how they're going to paint it. Because if you're China, you're still feeling the river and the stones there. So you don't want to also directly attack the Marcos administration this early on. So for me, I think Xi Jinping just wants to feel that things can remain on an even keel, even if Marcos is rapidly revitalizing our defense relations with the United
Cleve
States.
and Robin, was President Marcos in the same mode of feeling out lang muna to, tansyahin lang muna natin how he reacts to whatever words, whatever we say?
Well, yeah, President Marcos accepted the invitation of Xi Jinping to go on an official trip to China in January 3. So I guess it's also quite important for Philippine-China-US relations. So while Kamala Harris is coming next week, right, and the Philippines accepted that visit, going to Palawan, and one of the bases, right? It's not just near the Spratlys, but it's one of the bases that was agreed upon in the EDCA, right? So that's quite important to look at. But this visit also comes in the very important geopolitical moment where Xi Jinping just won his third 5-year term. And if he was aggressive in the last 10 years, we don't know how aggressive he'll be in the next 5 years.
No, we already had hints of it inside the country.
Correct.
Yeah. I'd also like to point out kind of like the domestic dynamics of these changes in foreign policy. We as Richard and Robin said, we see that the foreign policy of President Marcos will be quite different from the previous administration. So this is not going to be friendlier towards China, but an attempt to balance the relationship between US and China in the Philippines, more like the Marcos Sr. administration. And I think it's quite important that we see that the Vice President, for example, Vice President Sara, during the time that President Marcos was in the US and announced that, he's willing to work with Washington closely and kind of like pivot back to this traditional relationship with the States. So you have the Vice President Sara Duterte also releasing a video of congratulating the anniversary
in Mandarin.
In Mandarin. There was an attempt.
Or whatever you call
that. I think it's not an accident. It's by design that there's this kind of balancing within the administration itself. So we know that Duterte policy, Duterte coalition is kind of closer to China. So I can imagine that Chinese officials are also watching the domestic political developments between how internally, this coalition between Marcos and Duterte will also affect the foreign policy of the country.
We were talking last night to Professor Badlawin. Sabi nga niya, it was a chance for both sides to size each other up
Exactly.
in person and possibly to set the tone for January, for next year. But yun nga, it comes after Duterte, which was wildly on the other side of the spectrum. So how do you think President Bongbong Marcos struck
I think
Xi Jinping, and how will he recalibrate, if he has to at all, his position towards the Philippines?
Yeah, I know Richard has written about this. I think President Bongbong Marcos' foreign policy is quite a clear shift away from the Duterte foreign policy. For example, the DND just announced today, or I think yesterday, the $60 million investment of the U.S. that they accepted to expand and really actually continue the EDCA that was struck during the Aquino administration. So in that sense, in fact, the continuation of the EDCA is more similar to the foreign policy of Aquino than it is to the foreign policy of Duterte. But I mean, we definitely have to caution. Yeah, which is quite ironic, right? So we shall see how Bongbong Marcos will try to balance China and the U.S. But it's still not a return to pre-Duterte, to Aquino.
No, but
It's neither nor, no? I mean, under the reformist liberal president, we had a much more U.S.-centric, democracy-friendly foreign policy. Under Duterte, was much more China, Russia-friendly. Marcos is neither nor, right? It's completely different synthesis. And you could even argue that he kind of owes that to Duterte, because what Duterte did was, President Duterte was able to reset the terms of our relations with the U.S., make it more transactional, right? Art of the deal, Trump style. So that makes it easier for Marcos to come in and renegotiate the relationship on terms that are more mutually beneficial and balanced. Because let's be honest, we were taken for granted by the Americans back in the day. Let's be honest. Like when Obama was here in 2014, twice he was asked by our friends in the journalism world, are you going to be with us in the Scarborough Shoal? And he kept on giving lawyerly answers. No offense to our lawyer friends. But now it's different, right? U.S. is very clear. If there's an attack on your vessels, on your troops, your military personnel in West Philippine Sea, the MBT will be applied. So President Duterte inadvertently, I don't think that's because of the genius of it, inadvertently made the Americans realize the Philippines cannot be taken for granted. So President Marcos Jr. is operating from a better leverage position. Nonetheless, the big other problem also coming from the Duterte administration is what I call the pledge trap. Everyone said there'll be debt trap. China invests, malunod tayo sa utang. Sabi ko, where are the investments, right? None. Like, no serious investments from China. So I think Marcos Jr. wants a much more results-oriented relationship with China. It's like, you want, bring it, show it to me, and give us good deals, because the Indonesians got the...
Show me the money.
Show me the money and good interest rate money, not just any money. Because the Indonesian under Jokowi got very good deal from the Chinese, 1% interest rate on that Bandung-Jakarta projects. We're getting, what, 3.5 to 4%?
But do you think everything is grounded and formulated already well enough for President Marcos to keep him from swinging, wildly between... as we said, the time frame for this is not just APEC. We're expecting he's going to be visiting China, but that's after Kamala Harris comes here. There's a danger if that policy, if that is not actually a strategy, and it's not well formulated and grounded at this point, that he'll just be swinging wildly and feeling his way between these two powers.
I think you can be tactical, situational for quite some time, because we're in the midst of many massive changes. Let's not forget the Bali détente, when Biden and Xi met and kind of said, okay, we're inevitably going to have competition, but pare, wag naman tayo all out, kasi it doesn't serve any of us. And both presidents were coming from a strong domestic position. Biden's party did way better. The best since JFK, as we discussed, as far as midterm elections is concerned, the first term. And of course, Xi Jinping secured. Third term, not really won. So if you're the Philippines, you're also looking at the big picture of the giants, and then you're adjusting. But at the end of the day, you're absolutely right. You cannot just be tactical, situational. Nahikisakay na lang sa trend. Dapat meron ka ring sariling coherent policy down the road, and it's not going to be easy. I want to be fair.
But again, back to that question, Cleve. If it's still tactical at this point, and you have some time to be tactical about it, does that answer the question that, well, kasi wala pang well-formulated policy and strategy?
In fairness to President Marcos Jr., he's made a very good appointment in his foreign affairs secretary. So we also trust that the entire foreign policy bureaucracy has a strategy, in dealing with these two powers. But I can also imagine that Marcos will also be tempted to do this kind of swinging tactical swings that you have been mentioning, because let's not forget, this foreign policy is being performed by the president who just years ago is not really welcomed and embraced by the international community. So he's re-entering, and it's quite surprising actually how warm and how receptive the international community has been to Marcos Jr. For example, even President Biden, U.S. President Biden, was part of the committee that declared the snap election during the time of Marcos Sr. as fraudulent, for example. So I think that kind of personal baggages of President Marcos, he's now able to make foreign trips. He's now able to visit these countries that before he couldn't really. He can now represent the Philippines again and talk about the legacies of his family in running the Philippines. That will definitely affect as well the character of foreign policy and in dealing with both China and the U.S., where I think we see that both powers are trying to court, talagang nililigawan si President Marcos, right? Sending the highest delegations possible, rolling out the red carpet in his visits, and we're likely to see that happening in the coming days as well.
Well, Robin had a point kanina when he pointed out na si Xi Jinping just won another term, but
Secured, yeah.
but also,
Since it's not an election, let's be honest.
okay, there you go.
Selection.
But at the same time, you have Bongbong Marcos coming in with the biggest margin for any Philippine president. So they're actually both very well positioned, at least internally, to make any. I mean, they have the political capital in their own terms.
Yep.
How does that play out? Could that be any kind of a leverage in terms of, for example, dealing with each other?
Well, I mean, it's quite different when you talk about China and the Philippines. We've seen really a huge turnout for Bongbong Marcos. But actually, the three of us were just talking about how do we really assess the opposition in 2025 and in 2028 and what's going to happen. And I'm very happy to talk about that tonight, definitely. But maybe just quickly, what I'd say is we still don't have a foreign policy towards great powers quickly. So that's something maybe that the new Secretary of Defense might be able to do. So there's still internal domestic political issues. There's some people saying that it's Gilbert Chudoro who's going to take up the defense post. Yeah. So of course that's up to Bongbong, and defense is definitely one of the things that makes Bongbong popular. And we'll see whether or not the popularity of Bongbong will extend to foreign policy.
Okay. And we do want to talk about the opposition. It's not even necessarily 2025. I do want to ask about that. We'll get into that later on. But before we leave this topic, something that Cleve said, President Marcos and his personal profile in the international community. I don't know. This is an impression. It's not a question. But it seems to me this is clearly one of the things he gets up for. I mean, this.
You said it, right? Rebranding. They're in a rebranding. What amazes me, I'm sure Cleve was supposed to answer that, but what amazes me is that you have a democratic administration in White House. You had a democracy summit last year. You have a president like Biden who's saying he's going to make democracy promotion a centerpiece of his foreign policy. And then whenever they meet Marcos or this administration, they tiptoe around, some really issues, right? So you could see, if you're Marcos, you're going to feel so good. Like, see, even the Democrats are going to. And let's not forget, I think Kamala Harris will more or less formalize the proceedings of Marcos' visit to the White House next year. And the big debate right now is which countries will come first. Is it China, which most likely will be the first, and then what, US, Japan, ganun. So you can just see how important the competition with China is for the US, that even a democratic administration with so much emphasis on democratic promotion is so careful and overly nice, you would even say, when it comes to this administration.
On the other hand, why should that necessarily be surprising?
Because they cannot afford to lose the Philippines.
But it is a democratically elected president. That's the minimum that they can stand on. But beyond the dilemmas of the other countries on how to relate, to us and to this government in particular. What I wanted to ask about was if you agree with me that there is this is really, as I said, one of the things he gets up for. ASEAN Summit, APEC, meeting with Tony Blair, getting his standing there with Xi Jinping, and so on. What does that mean if you have that kind, not just of a personality, but a motivation on the part of our president to have international community approval, to have international community acceptance? What might that mean for his presidency, his leadership, and the values and the direction of the country as a whole?
I actually share the observation. I think that they've probably seen, the international community has probably seen the president more than Filipinos attending meetings and talking to the media and talking to the public. No, and I think this is a very important context, because we also and if there's something that I would applaud the President Marcos for, is that his willingness to really be part of the international community and kind of like take up space in the international community. We've heard in his past speeches before, including the State of the Nation address, that he wants the Philippines to play a bigger international role. Like he talked about what ASEAN could possibly do in the conflict in Myanmar, what the Philippines could actually do in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine as well, right? So there are indications that this is a president that's willing to take some space, and I think that's it's a perfect time. No, we'd like to imagine Philippines as a very small country, but we're not, right? We are a nation of 110 million people. We are among the largest democracies in the world, and our economy is about to grow as one of the biggest economies as well a few decades from now. So I think that particular direction that President Marcos is taking is laudable. But we also know that the historical context of that particular need to kind of like flirt with the international community, be present, be seen, is also because this is a restorationist president. Yeah. They've been humiliated. They've been abandoned by the international community, if you will, especially, for example, the United States, which they thought were strong allies of the Marcos Sr. administration. So they're just, I think, reintroducing themselves back. And that's why, as you would describe it, President Marcos is willing to get up for this summit. I could see the why, and I could see why he would want that.
And he's coming after Duterte, who had a very colorful school of diplomacy. Right?
But yeah,
so he has to do some, let's say, PR catch-up.
It is a low bar, but motivations and the pragmatics aside, does that also mean that at the very least you have a president who can be nudged by the international community on certain values and certain? I don't know how far you can nudge him when it comes to, the awkward situations of his family. I don't know how far you can nudge him when it comes to accountability for his parents and his family, for corruption and human rights and all of that. But in nudging him, for example, towards the ICC, in nudging him in keeping this direction on human rights and press freedom and democracy, do you see him?
He already recalibrating? Because on the war on drugs, he said rehabilitation, which will be more focused. There'll be more SOPs and rule of law. On Percy Lapid's murder case, we see the president making statements, strong statements, having the DLG secretary, justice secretary on top of it. Of course, we want to see the investigation release, but you can see how he's also constantly on top of it. And I think it's part of the, projecting that but I'm not the same Marcos Sr. I'm not like my father when it comes to human rights and
but
press
correct me if I'm
freedom.
wrong, Ed. I mean, Percy Lapid is a good example because the first statement was rather weak.
Right.
The first statement was rather weak, and then you had some criticism, some outcry, and parang condemn. You have to condemn.
Right.
And that came both locally as well as internationally, and then they recalibrated, as you said, the message. But the point is precisely that, unlike President Duterte, which we all agreed that was a pretty low bar, but at least with President Marcos, whether you call it listening or innate or real values or not, there are some signs that, as I said, he can be.
But remember,
vulnerable
Cleve and Robin mentioned their vice president is a Duterte too. So, you know, Marcos cannot go 180 degrees. He has to go 110 degrees. What I'm saying is that we have to be realistic about how much nudging you can do to him when he has a Duterte next to him. You get what I'm saying? So that's why maybe you have to be more fair and
That's also going to be an interesting discussion.
Do you know what I'm saying? I already
that.
did the transition to the next one, which Robin will take. Sorry, I had to do it.
Okay, ayan na, may teaser na tayo. Thank you for that. We will continue this discussion in all these other directions with our panel after this breather. The Chiefs will be right back.
Senate Minority Leader Coco Pimentel has allowed in principle to let President Bongbong Marcos keep his confidential funds. Meanwhile, the Education Department's proposed budget for 2023 has hurdled the Senate plenary.
I hope that our colleagues in the Senate will share the view that there are no extraordinarily compelling reasons to provide a confidential fund to the education agency.
For the record, for our colleagues, Mr. President, karamihan ng realignment, if not all, came from the flexible learning, no? Because at the time we passed that budget for 2022, we had to prepare for the pandemic.
Romeo Lumagi Jr. took his oath as the new head of the Bureau of Internal Revenue, replacing Lilia Guillermo. Prior to his new appointment, Lumagi served as the Bureau's Deputy Commissioner.
Welcome back to the Chiefs here in One News, and still with us, geopolitical expert Richard Heydarian, political scientist Robin Garcia, and Cleve Arguelles. I know you want to go into the political side of things already, but let me squeeze in one more question about the West Philippine Sea, or the South China Sea, if you may. Okay, well, we've heard the statements after yesterday's meeting. More or less they're generic. It's more of a getting to know you thing than anything else. Pero what could, or how could things change in terms of how the two countries and the two leaders are going to deal with the West Philippine Sea in the next 6 years, now that they've met each other, now that they've sized each other up? What could possibly change pa?
Well, actually, I'm waiting for the president to come out with a definitive foreign policy towards China. We don't have that yet. I haven't seen a foreign policy towards the United States and China and how to deal with the great powers. Usually the Department of Defense and the Foreign Affairs departments are the ones that publish that after convening an expert group, for example, of scholars and defense policy experts. They usually come up with a comprehensive blueprint. So I haven't seen that yet, to be honest. There's not a lot of things, the statements that can be gleaned from the meetings.
Yeah, because they talk, for example, about friendly discussions and all that. But in the end, when boats meet each other in the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea, they're not friendly.
Yeah, I think Robin is hoping that there'll be a national security strategy, national defense strategy, NDS, NS. We need things like that. I mean, the last time we had a white paper was Siguro the National Security Advisor or former professor. Like, I think they can help in this direction. For me, at least Marcos Jr. is making the red lines clear, because they were becoming pink lines under Duterte, which is, like what's happening in the West Philippine Sea. At least now, Marcos made it clear. First
Okay.
of all, we want a legally binding code of conduct. Not any kind of blah, 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 but legally binding. Second, we're okay to join exploration, but not undermining the Philippine sovereignty. In Asian Society speech in New York, he made it clear, we have no dispute with China. They're claiming what's ours. I like that. I think that's very important. You can just say it's rhetoric, but you know what? Rhetoric matters when it comes from the mouth of the President of the Republic. And considering what we were dealing with just a year ago or so, not to mention the arbitration award. He made it very clear that the arbitration award is final and binding. So at least he's making some of the pink lines more red lines. No, that kind of gave wrong impression, right? But I mean it in a geopolitical sense because I don't know much about domestic politics. So, so speaking of, for me that's good enough. And then lastly, even on the Chinese infrastructure projects, we suspended 3 railway projects because there was nothing happening. It was pledged up. So that's why suddenly the Chinese had to reconvene.
Anyway.
So for me, it's not a national security strategy paper. It's not coherent doctrine. But it's a beginning of something sensible in terms of strategy, not just tactics. Again, but you're absolutely right.
Or at least relative, as you always say.
Again,
to the
politics is always relative.
Which brings us to your. You seem quite eager to get to this topic. Relative to the previous administration, the Marcos administration, relative to the Duterte administration, the fact that they are both in Malacanang right now. What does that mean? And I know we've been talking about President Marcos. People haven't been talking about Vice President Duterte all this time. In the meantime, she gets her own confidential intelligence funds. What I mean, your assessment first on the first months of Vice President Duterte.
Yeah, I think it's very clear that the Vice President is not a spare tire in this administration. Right. Formally, legally, she's been given the education portfolio, which is a very difficult task to handle. But also informally, we also see signs that she's not willing to be, to be marginalized and to be hidden.
Let's be explicit. What are those
behind the stage? No? So, for example, you usually just expect that the president, as the chief architect of foreign policy, should handle all foreign policy. But Vice President Sara Duterte made that surprising attempt to kind of like send a message to the Chinese government, right?
This is the Mandarin message.
The Mandarin.
And when the president left the country, she convened all the national security officials.
Yes.
That was surprising, huh?
Yes, and you also see, for example, an attempt to portray herself as a very hardworking vice president. That she's very tired of all of the the demands of the vice presidency. Right. All the while there are some rumors online that we see a hands-off president, that that the president is not working as hard as he should be. So this is a vice president that's conscious of her place, and we see that until if we've been talking about the balance of power internationally, we also see that the players in the Philippines, domestically within Malacanang, they're also quite conscious in terms of the balance of power within the Malacanang coalition, and the Duterte faction. Vice President Sara Duterte is one among those coalitions.
But how do you see the dynamics between the two? Kasi, for example, Sara Duterte wanted the defense portfolio. It was not given to her. And she was very, very vocal about that portfolio before it was rejected, di ba? Parang that was like, parang pahiyaan yun.
Yes. And I think that was the Vice President's first lesson in kind of like the difference between running an election and being in power and governing, right? That you can't just publicly declare that you will be getting that portfolio. You have to wait for the president. At the end of the day, the president heads this coalition. But I think the vice president mistook their relationship during the campaign period, that she's that they have an equal kind of like relationship, right? But this is. And that's the challenge. This is not a coalition among equals. There will always be differences. There will always be within coalition challenges in terms of who calls the shots. And I think that's one of the effects of that she was publicly humiliated and was given a different portfolio.
Pero kasi everybody's looking 6 years down the line. You have a president who's got only one term. And so eventually, ang tatakbo na lang for the next term cannot be Bongbong Marcos anymore, but everybody's saying it's probably Sara Duterte. How does that figure into how things are developing in the next 6 years now?
Rob, you're the political scientist. I'm just geopolitical expert.
Everyone's looking at the next presidential election. Parang siya na ang ano.
But shouldn't you look at 2025 first?
Well, that too.
Exactly. That was what I was going to say. You have to look at whether or not Marcos and Duterte will go in the 2025 elections united or not, right? Because they might endorse different people. They might form a different slate. Marcos might even, create his own political party, and that's where we'll see clearly the cracks of the administration. We don't know if, the fulcrum of all of this is Martin Romualdez as a leader of the CMD, but because he's also the cousin of BBM and also the campaign manager of Sara Duterte. But beyond that, right, will we see a united Marcos Duterte going in 2025 or not? Or, Sara Duterte might even join the opposition, who knows, right? It might be. I mean,
we're trying to put the pieces of Marcos and Duterte.
It's less of a coup d'etat.
We're trying to put the pieces of Marcos and Duterte as if silang dalawa lang. But we know the politics here. To borrow a phrase from me, ano ba? 2028.
Well, I think Rafi Tulfo's are good. I mean, I think he's making waves very early on, saying the things that perhaps many people should have said before at the Senate, at the highest levels. Robin Hood Padilla, I think, will probably look at the vice presidency as another option. Amy Marcos, if she tops the Senate race in 2025, she could be in the mix. And by the
Amy
way,
will be how old by 2028?
well, President Duterte. That's
a good question.
I don't know. I mean, I think we're in a different world. But let's not forget, even on the Duterte Marcos one, there are some, I could even say, ideological policy differences. Like on the issue of red tagging, NPA, and all of that, I don't see Marcos as gung-ho on that issue, considering he also has the baggage of his father to deal with, versus what Sarah was saying when she was the officer in charge, right? Look at the issue of war on drugs. Marcos is not very gung-ho on an aggressive campaign against drugs, while the Dutertes are still hammering on that. If you look at the issue of China relations, as we discussed. So actually, there are some genuine policy, if not ideological differences, not to mention priority differences
Pero
down the
bago
road.
tayo dumating sa ideology, kumpletuhin pa natin mga pangalan. So, Tulfo, Robin Hood, Villar.
Riza Hontiveros.
We keep talking about Villar.
Yeah,
We keep
Cynthia
talking-
Which Villar?
Which Villar?
Maybe Cynthia, maybe the senator, maybe Senator Riza Ontiveros as well. We also have to think about what the former President Duterte, whether he would support someone, whether he would support his daughter or someone else,
Bongo.
right? I think what is clear at this point is that if there are any threats 6 years down the line or even in 2025, it's going to be from within the ruling coalition. It appears that the opposition, for example, Liberal Party or the previous coalition mobilized by the former Vice President Leni Robredo, it appears that there are all indications that they won't be, at least for now, they won't be able to rise create kind of like a threat or a challenge to the ruling coalition. So I think what we're trying to look at and what we will be observing is how these different parties within the ruling coalition will move forward and create game plans for 2025. For example, the First Family is a party of its own, right? It's a party of its own, and within the First Family, there are also within competitions, right, on their own, right? And then you also have the coalition or the faction led by former President Arroyo. You have the faction led by former President Duterte, and also a different flavor of that faction led by the Vice President Duterte. And I could imagine that all of these different factions would have different game plans for 2025 and not necessarily the same kind of
There
goal,
certainly
right?
won't be one single plan that will bring all of those people happily.
And let's not discount possibility of breakout stars at the 11th hour. I mean, Duterte was the breakout start at the 11th hour. I imagine up until third quarter of 2015, no one took him seriously, right? So let's not discount the possibility that some other people also can come along. For me, that's why I'm also watching not only what the presidents do, what are these factional politics, but also the political narratives. because narratives shape political preferences. And if the narrative, because narrative is so different right now compared to what we had under President Duterte, anti-oligarchy. So things could be psychologically very different in a few years down the road. And that's why I'm keeping my options very open in terms of who could be very top content. If Lenny runs for Senate in 2025 and ends up in top 3 or 4 and 5, she could be again in the conversation.
True.
You know, Marcos Jr. lost the vice presidency. They can say whatever they want, but the Supreme Court already made it clear. But he won the presidency decisively, right?
Yeah.
So it's no longer like before na isang beses ka lang sa buhay. Wala na yung mga tabu, wala na lahat eh. It's a very fluid picture. That's why for me, that's what excites me about our domestic politics, although I'm just a geopolitical expert, because I see fluidity, I see dynamism, I see wild swings and all of that. And I think that's why this fatalism na sila na lang manalo, walang hope yung opposition or whatever, like who's even the opposition, you know, I understand where they're coming from.
Okay, so who is the opposition and what do they need to do?
Well, if the liberal progressive don't get their act together, the opposition will be just political rivals, right? Like,
with what Robin said a while ago, na Sara Duterte could even be the opposition. But which opposition?
If President Marcos is a sinking ship, for example, she will protect her own image and make sure that she has a good chance in 2028. So in the middle of the road, maybe she can. I mean, this is hypothetical,
of course, not
right?
the opposition that we know of right now.
And then eventually, you know, she can even support an anti-Marcos, right? I mean, these are just wild speculations, but what I'm saying is these are political scenarios that we definitely have to look
because
at.
we have no real political parties, unlike the United States, right?
But even with that, we didn't really see the Partido Federal, for example, the nominal party of President Marcos Jr. Like we didn't really see a bandwagon of many politicians, local and national, to that particular party, right? Most of them like just retain their affiliation with Lakas CMD or the other members of the coalition. Some of them even stayed with PDP Laban. So that's very interesting because you know the expectation is that all of them will just jump ship to the administration party, give the administration a clear advantage on the midterm elections, right, and deliver a positive, resounding victory for the administration. But it's looking like, you know, it's going to be a different picture.
Pero profit also goes both ways. I mean, the federal candidate who won is not pushing for federalism anyway right now. It also goes both ways.
I think we can call that the hukbong effect, no? Like look at Sara Duterte. There was no out of nowhere she put the coalition together, right, with the center of gravity from the south, from the more Visayas-speaking vote. And next thing, that national politics changed. So I think people watched that and said, why should we even bother working within political parties? You can come up with massive coalitions and informally getting it done. The ASEAN way or Asian way, right? So that's why I'm not totally surprised that we're not seeing the clear alignments like LP won. I mean, when Aquino won, LP.
Correct.
Like now they don't even bother. Like why that? We can just have informal political coalitions. The Speaker of the House has a great relationship with the President. The Senate President seems to be on good. So that's why I'm saying like the metrics are changing because the tempo and
but
cadence
you mentioned the LP.
Yeah.
In passing, as you know,
I'm not the expert.
Is it still the default
Opposition,
thing that you think for? I mean, given as well, you know, the debacle after debacle,
Right.
Starting with Ocho Derecho, the last elections, and so on.
Tatlo na. Tatlo na, yeah.
Is it still the default party that you think of when we think about the opposition, or do you wipe that slate clean and just open yourself up to, you know, as you said, there are some surprise personalities just taking on that mantle?
Yeah, I think by default we still have the Liberal Party and their allies, and I think what's interesting is that usually in countries with very strong party systems, like if you keep losing elections, you usually get a major reshuffle of the leadership of your political party, and we haven't seen that yet. And that may mean that we will also not see significant changes in how the Liberal Party approach the elections. Also, quite disappointing personally that, for example, that there isn't really a political party that emerged out of the pink movement, the Kakam Pink movement, out of the campaign of the former vice president. Definitely, the idea to build.
You've moved past that. Past tense na tayo eh. Parang you've moved past that, or are you still holding out any thought na No, they're waiting for Lenny to come back, and then they're going to pick that up.
It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be the former vice president. What I'm saying is that, for example, all of this energy is put into like an NGO, Angat Buhay. It's a very noble cause, and I think it's doing real good work. But there's also a question of who's going to mobilize for votes and who's going to count votes during election day. And it's only a political party who could do that. And this is something that the opposition really needs right now, because if no one is really counting votes during election day, then as we've said, it's going to look like the real competition will only come from the within ruling coalition. You've had this kind of like the campaign regional people's council. It should have been transformed into party chapters in the provinces and the regions. And, if they've done that by 2025, they could probably win seats at the local level, if not at the national level.
But did Duterte have that kind of a mechanism or that kind of a machinery when he won in 2016? Diba? Parang he did not have that kind of machinery on the ground, nor the funding that the other parties had. But then again, he had this very unique narrative.
Yes, and so the Duterte electoral victory is kind of like an exception to the usual story of Philippine elections, right? Usually it's through electoral machineries that you get to win. It's through this grassroots election machineries. But Duterte had to rely on his charisma, on his popularity. This is also why when he got into power, although he also presided on a huge coalition, he compared to the president right now, very little baggage in terms of balancing the power and giving into the different players in the coalition. For example, right now, we see that even a man like the former executive secretary Vic Rodriguez, trusted and played a major role in the campaign, the President Marcos had to let him go because apparently some members of the coalition weren't happy. And I think this is the difference, because President Marcos is presiding on this coalitional presidentialism that he started even during the campaign, that and President Duterte didn't have this particular baggage going to Malacanang.
There are some people who say it's not the coalition that was the problem as far as Rodriguez was concerned. It was somebody more internal.
But I mean, let's go back to it. I mean, Duterte had a localized network, at least in Mindanao, right, which he could mobilize, and that gave him a center of gravity to pressure the more softy big parties to defect to him. I mean, for the opposition, they really have to work it from the grassroots upwards, right? I think national politics will be very difficult for a lot of top contenders, but winning, local seats, working from there. And look at it, Duterte's mayoral background was what made him a star. People like Isko Moreno or Vico Soto were, some of them are still very competitive, right? It was also their local executive government background. So my sense is maybe not for Lenny, but for some other opposition progressive figures, they have the next 6 years to work on their domestic, LGU level success, and from there work it up. Because at the end of the day, Filipino people, we like results. And it's at the LGU level when you can get a lot of results, not actually at the level of Senate and debates and all of that. It's really there. And there it's much more competitive and doable, I think, for the opposition than some of the more resource machinery heavy national regional level competition.
We're almost out of time. Let's round it back to President Marcos. I've seen some surveys. I don't actually at this point I don't know if it's been made public now, but I've seen some surveys that approval ratings are very, 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 very high for President Marcos. Do you believe that? Do you have any reason to doubt that? And if you do believe it and give credence to that, to what would you attribute that? Given that inflation is still out of control, it's still there was that mess internally within Malacanang, within his own team. He still has not appointed an agriculture secretary other than himself, which really seems unsustainable.
But he's in the honeymoon phase, right? He's in the honeymoon phase.
Still, but I guess that's my question.
Like,
is it still the honeymoon? Is it still the honeymoon phase?
Right.
I mean, and do you believe that the high approval ratings? And to what would you attribute it?
I'm sure they have. I'll just be very quick about this. The thing is, first of all, there's a honeymoon phase. The other thing is, honestly, I kind of agree with Randy David, my fellow columnist and inquirer. He says that actually, if you want to really look at issue-based ratings. So I think we clearly saw in the Pulse Asia survey, when people were asked about government's handling of inflation, they got a very low grade. And that was enough to really spur the government to aggressively respond to the inflation issue. Like, look at what the Bangko Sentral, they're independent, but look at how much there's focus on inflation issue. Look at how much Marcos has to say, baka yung bigas maging 20 peso na, yung meron silang initiative. Do you get what I'm saying? Like, just looking at raw numbers, because let's be honest, when voters are asked, do you like the president or not, it's kind of like a binary. If it's new and he got 60% of the vote, let's go with it. But I think you really get the sentiment of people when you go issue to issue, especially urgent issues. That's why the surveys I'm interested in are issue-based questions and approval ratings. And clearly, on some fronts, inflation was the only majority issue, right, among the urgent issue. And that's where actually had net negative, if I'm not mistaken, right? So that, for me, says a lot. That's what I want to look at, not these gross numbers, etc., which I don't think really capture the complexity of people's emotions and feelings about the state of affairs. Yeah.
But even though they may be disappointed in some issues, it's also easy to imagine why the president would retain his popularity, given that every time he faces an issue, for example, inflation or the price of rice, no, or for example something that he said on air, he has this army of trolls and influencers and thought leaders online that would back him up. And this is not something that we've seen. This is we've seen in the past administration, but not, for example, in the Aquino administration. That if he's being grilled by the media, then it's hard for an alternative kind of narrative to emerge and be made popular. And so in the case of President Marcos, he has his PR team to keep himself clean and pure in the eyes of the people. And I think if we associate the popularity of President Duterte with his populist charisma, I think in the case of this president, it's the old story of mobilizing a nationalist constituency. I think President Marcos really banked on the aspirational kind of constituency, promising that Philippines will be kind of great again. We will return to the good old days. You see him, for example, appearing in the world stage, taking up space and speaking for the Filipino people. So even though they couldn't buy the rice anymore or the onions because the prices are too high, at least they see the president rallying and speaking for the Philippines. And I could imagine that could inspire emotional support, positive emotional support for the president still.
Teka, tuhugin ko na rin yan. Nabanggit mo na yung bigas eh. we have the 25 peso per kilo rice in the Kadiwa stores. The president says papalapit na yung 20 pesos. I mean, the 20 peso per kilo rice, that was like a sword hanging over his neck, at least for a while, until people forgot about it.
Until he dangled it again.
Well, what do you think of it? How do you view this? The 25 pesos versus the 20 pesos versus the entirety of 38 pesos sa palengke.
I think material economic realities have to be framed and constructed.
Right.
So, I mean, there's an active effort by the administration to make it not a problem. We don't see...
Hindi kayo gutom?
Yun. Hindi kayo gutom, okay lang kayo.
Hindi kayo nahihirapan.
But we don't see an eloquent, effective opposition to reframe and make people dissatisfied, right? So, I mean, back to the movement. So it's sort of a relational issue, right? So you need the administration failing to convince people everything's okay, and you need some fire from the grassroots, for example, or from alternative talking heads telling you that your material reality is not okay, right? So you need that.
And that's what we see online actually, di ba? Na ang arte nyo naman, kumain kayo ng ganito, right? Don't eat white rice, eat NFA rice, right? I mean, and you can imagine why some people would say, oh, right, I should probably have realized na ang arte ko, right? And, if President Marcos, I think yung kadiwa niya, we're talking about NFA rice na he'll be able to bring the price down to 20 pesos. If he will be able to do it, then I think, good job. Kasi if there's something that we have expected from this presidency is that the expectations are really high and that they, if I were President Marcos, I would want to deliver. Our legacy is at stake again. And because they have a deep bench of potential candidates 6 years, 12 years from now, then there's also deep incentives for them to be able to do that. How they will be able to do it, that's another story. Whether they will just force, for example, some officials to...
Pahabol lang ako, but isn't it
to
also
order the price.
possible that you could also have a Teflon president na kahit anong mangyari, kahit anong gawin niya, hindi didikit sa kanya?
Well, as long as
he
they can
still be
construct a
charming.
narrative, like look at how they're doing it now, right? If mataas ang inflation, kasalanan ng external factors, right? Pero kung tumaas ang growth rate, ito ay dahil sa napakagaling na presidente na meron tayo, right? You're having it both ways, right?
Exactly.
And they're kind of pulling it off, exactly as my political scientist fellows have been saying, right? If you're good in performative populism and politics, which both Marcoses and Dutertes are master of, if you are good in narrative building, and then yung opposition mo ay medyo wind down, let's just call it what it is, right? Talagang sabi ng tao, yeah, medyo gutom ako, pero nga, hindi naman kasalanan ni BBM.
Kasalanan ni Secretary.
Kasalanan ng Fed rate hike
I
ng
mean,
US.
it's a very basic question. Are they both? Or would you equate his being Teflon to President Duterte? Because si President Duterte naligo na sa putik, tuwa pa rin yung mga tao. Tawa-tawa pa rin sa kanya yung mga tao.
He didn't need creative
It was the opposite of Teflon, di ba? Duterte
Yeah.
was saying, ako na, dudumihan ko na yung sarili ko. But do you really believe that President Marcos can take that? I mean, you mentioned it is still
Probably
the honeymoon phase.
Yeah,
Once
I think
we get
so.
past the Christmas, na mataas pa rin ang presyo ng bigas, and he still does not find his exit out of this very awkward position at the Department of Agriculture, something's got to give by the first quarter, don't you think? And do you think he can withstand that the way Duterte can withstand his rape jokes, can withstand his own, his own being brusque and so on?
If he gets Roque as his spokesman, maybe, he can. If may 1 year pa siya. I'm just saying, like, I believe in the power of performative communications with what I saw with President Duterte. But you're right. Next year is going to be very hard for the Philippines. There's going to be likely recession, global recession. Magkakaalaman na.
I'd like to ask more, but we don't have enough time. But I think it's more to Robin's point that there's nobody on the other side.
Alternative.
That's getting people past the Jedi mind trick na hindi ka nagugutom. Di ba? Hindi mo
Hindi namin kasalanan na gutom kayo. It's more like that. Let's be fair.
Sige.
Hindi kayo na.
Jedi mind trick.
Medyo may tricks na yata. Hindi na Jedi.
Well, anyway, we obviously enjoyed this, and we enjoy more. We would enjoy more of these live guests. Shout out na rin sa lahat ng mga gine-guest ng The Chiefs. We're open. So we really hope we can get more of you here. And that's it in the meantime this week for The Chiefs. Sa ngalan din po.
Pasalamat ka naman sa guest natin.
Salamat kay Cleve, kay Prof. Richard, kay Robin. Maraming salamat po.
Salamat din po.
At sa ngalan din po kay Ami Pamintuan at Tucci Cruz Valdez, we hope it was discussed. We'll keep the conversation going. I'm Robbie Alampay.
I'm Ed Lingao. We are One News, all sides, all the time.